the Facebook page and the YouTube channel. My name is Annie. I'm the events coordinator at Majors & Quinn Booksellers, which is an independent bookstore in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm very excited to be bringing you another virtual author event, a virtual author conversation tonight. Tonight we're very pleased to have Kevin Barry discussing his newest collection of short stories with another author, CJ Hauser. And both of the authors have books available at majorsandquinn.com. I will drop links into the chat during the event. Speaking of the chat, whether you're watching on Facebook or on YouTube, if you have questions for our authors, that is where you should write them. We will get to questions at the end of the hour. So if you think of anything at any point during the event, please go ahead and ask your question whenever it occurs to you. We also will remind you. We are going to hear a little bit from Kevin's new collection, and after that, CJ will come back and we will have a conversation about stories in that old country music. Allow me to briefly introduce our wonderful speakers today. We have Kevin Barry, the author of the novels Night Boat to Tangier, Beetlebone, and City of Bohan, and the story collections Dark Lies the Island and There Are Little Kingdoms. His awards include the IMPAC Dublin Literary Award, the Goldsmiths Prize, the Sunday Times EFG Short Story Prize, and the Lannan Foundation Literary Award. His stories and essays appear in The New Yorker, Granta, and elsewhere. He also works as a playwright and a screenwriter, and he lives in County Sligo, Ireland. So it is indeed midnight where Kevin is right now. So thank you for doing this, Kevin. And we also are so pleased to have CJ Hauser, who teaches creative writing and literature at Colgate University. Her most recent novel, Family of Origin, was published by Doubleday. She is also the author of the novel The Fromaways, and her fiction has appeared or is forthcoming in Tin House, Narrative Magazine, Paris Review, Tri-Quarterly, Esquire, Third Coast, and the Kenyon Review. She holds an MFA from Brooklyn College and a PhD from Florida State University and lives in Hamilton, New York. And I am so pleased to have both of you here. I'm so excited to hear you discuss this collection. And I will be back at the end of the hour to help take questions. So without further ado, and I will disappear, and Kevin is going to read to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Annie. Thanks so much for that introduction. I hope I don't seem too weary. I am quite used to being up at midnight here in South County Sligo, which is about 20 miles from the Atlantic coast, and it's January, and it's dark, and it's kind of wintry, and it's not full of the joys really at this time of the year, but it's still a beautiful place in its kind of melancholy winter way. Most of the stories in this new collection, I haven't got my hands on the beautiful new Doubleday US edition yet. All transport cargo lifts are complicated with the plague. But I'm reading from the European edition from Canongate. I'm going to read just a couple of pages from one of the stories, a story called Ox Mountain Death Song. It's written in 16 very short little sections. I'll read the first 4 or so and see how we get on. I apologize in advance always for my work because it's loaded with sort of profanity and swearing. But it's because my people, my race, the Irish people, were a very profane type of person, and then it's maybe something that could be interesting to discuss in a little while is the profanity. So apologies in advance. This is Ox Mountain Death Song. 1. He had been planting babies all over the Ox Mountains since he was 17 years old. Well, he had the hair for it, and the ferret grinned. And there was hardly a female specimen along that part of the Sligo-Mayo border that hadn't taken the scan of his hazel glance, or hadn't had the hard word laid on in the dark corners of bars, or in the hormone maelstrom of the country discos, or in untaxed cars down back roads under the silly, silly moonlight. He had soft, girlish eyelashes and pig-ignorant shoulders. Sex on a stick was his own opinion, and too many of the girls, too many of the women shared it. He kept several on the string at any given time, but as soon as they got weight on them, he left them. Now, there are those who in a lifetime cannot leave a woman, who cannot gather the strength or get past the sentiment, but Canavan left them every day. 2. The first time Sergeant Brown came across this latest Canavan, he was from a family a long while notorious, was in the station house when the boy was 14 and had totaled a stolen Toyota Celica on the Ballymount Road, and the first thing the sergeant did was hit him the slap of a phone book across the back of the head. "That'll take the fucking ferret out of you," he said. Though of course it did not, and Canavan just smirked sexily. The witch hazel of the eyes and the sulphur of the smirk, these betrayed to the sergeant that young Canavan would, at some future point, kill. So he hit him another slap at the phone book. "Lose the fucking face," he cried. "You're not only a fucking knacker off the ox." If the regal youth felt pain, it did not show. He merely flicked his blonde fringe, spat a toot, and spoke in a voice already deep down and mannish. "You're not only a fucking swing key," he said. 3. Come up to a humid Sunday of late June. The day had the ominous feeling of such grey, dense Sundays it was sour with foreboding as the vapours of paranoia floated in from Killala Bay, and the ridgeback line of the Ox Mountains lay prone like a crouched beast, their tone dark bluish in the haze, sombre and watchful like a beast. The detective, Sergeant Tom Brown plainly, drove an unmarked Primera along the sea road in his flop sweat and rancour. "Bastard," he said. He was trying to get a fix on the Canavan's movements, but to no avail. The little fucker was like water through your hands, and what troubled the sergeant above all was the fact of the fungating mass. This Canavan was not long for the world or its women. He might do anything now. 4. Sergeant Brown was from a line of guards. His father had been the sergeant at Ochris before he drank himself into the clay of the place. His father's father had, at the time it was still Royal Irish Constabulary, been the sergeant at Ballinacaro before he drank himself into the clay of the place. His father's father's father had been the sergeant at Easky when they were still jawing grass at the side of the road and spitting the green juice, and he, too, had drank himself into the clay of the place. Sergeant Tom Brown did not drink. He suffered instead the terrible want of a sweet tooth. Sugar ran him. He sat in a humid murk, himself vaporous, gently steaming, in the Primera, outside the Emo station, on the N59, beneath the hateful shadow of the Ox Mountain, and he ate a Swiss roll. Looked at himself in the mirror, big sticky face like a child's. "Here's another day I get fucking fatter," he said. He wheezed terribly now, climbing a stair. He wheezed as hard again, coming down a stair. He hadn't enjoyed a mirror since the late 1980s. He was 65 now, and just 3 weeks from his retirement. His determination was to have Canavan looked after before it. Well, I'll pause the story there. Thank you. So I think we say hello to CJ now. Hi, CJ.
The joy of that for me, I cannot overstate, to hear you read it in your own.
Thank you. In my accent.
It's necessary. And I think that's what I want to ask you first, actually, is that I feel like there are such strong rhythms to the stories in this collection and to your work in general. And I find them, I'm somewhat porous to cadence, and I find them sort of trotting around my head after I put down the book. And I wonder, I read in a Guardian interview that you're a great reader of poetry, so perhaps part of that, or maybe it's just the rhythms of an accent that is not mine. And so I wonder if you could talk about rhythm and reading out loud.
Yeah, reading poetry is very important to me, actually. As a writer, I try to read poems every night after my dinner, even if it's only for kind of 5 minutes. And I try to read new stuff, but I go back to favorites all the time as well. Sort of kind of a lot of kind of mid 20th century stuff. Would be the typical fare. And I try to learn poems still. I try to learn poems by heart. It's kind of something that my wife and I are quite competitive about. We learn poems and have competitions in which we have to recite the poems. And it gets very, very nerve-ridden and difficult. But it just strikes me as something that's good for my brain, for my aging brain at this point, that it just does something to keep the synapses firing in some ways. I certainly write a type of prose fiction that aspires in places to the condition of poetry. I have a lyric impulse in my work, which is something that I maybe tried to barb a little when I was younger as a writer, with my earlier books. For example, in the novel City of Bohan, if I wrote a lyric, a couple of sentences or half a paragraph, I would immediately try and kind of take the piss out of it subsequently in the next couple of lines, just to kind of, say, I can do this, but I'm also above it almost. And now as I get older, I'm kind of more inclined to kind of just unashamedly go with my lyric impulse. But it's an interesting time for me to put a collection together, because my last collection came out in 2012, I think, on this side. So it's a chunk of time, it's 8 or 9 years. It's enough to see yourself changing as a writer. Actually, the Ox Mountain Death Song is the oldest story in the book. I think I wrote it about 2012 or so. And it seems to be very much of that era in my writing life. So it's a cool thing if you're trying to get stories all the time. They do work as a kind of a diary of your writing life, the way you're changing and the way it's going. I can never remember the original questions, and I just sort of rattle on.
No, it's the best. And now I have all these questions I wrote down to ask you, but now I'm going to ask you something because of what you just said. This idea of sort of barbing the lyric, like the idea that there are things that when you're younger you think, oh, like I can't write this way, or if I do write this way, only in this proportion, and I have to sort of cushion the blow of whatever effect it has. I don't know. What do you think it means to sort of let go of that as you evolve, or to?
Yeah. I think over the course of your kind of early work and over the course of your early books, the motion is often kind of circular. You're kind of hovering in around your fundamental kind of themes and topics and kind of issues, and you have to get brave, to really get into that stuff. And it's really interesting. I think I bet if you ask any writer of prose fiction, it's the bits sometimes that you strike upon early on when that make you kind of recoil in horror from the page. That's when you're getting closer, to your real stuff. And I bet it's something about your family, or it's something that happened to you. It's always the close in stuff that's like when I was trying to write fiction first. This was mostly in Cork City, Ireland's second kind of city down on the south coast. Like in a serious way, from my kind of mid-20s, trying to write fiction, but all I was interested in being was the next great Jewish American novelist, because I was obsessed with Saul Bellow especially, but also people like Philip Roth, and I was convinced I was the next great Jewish American novelist, and it didn't work out in any way. I even went to my first trip to the US was to Butte, Montana. I decided I was going to set my great Jewish American novel in Butte, Montana. So I flew to Seattle, and I got on a crazy, what did it call, a Greyhound bus, with all these people who kept sitting alongside me saying, "Hey, I just got out of jail, buddy," all this kind of stuff. And I got to Butte, Montana at 6 a.m. or something, and looked around, and it was very clear immediately that this was not a Jewish town. My Jewish American novel was, but I actually wrote it. And it's upstairs under the bed. Never will human eyes fall on this piece of work. If I think about it now, there's about 100,000 words of it up there, and it's I'm almost still uncomfortable to have it in the house, because I'm just in that early first attempt at something where you're trying on airs, and you're trying to be some awful mix of whatever I was reading at the time, which would have been an unholy mix of kind of like Flannery O'Connor and Saul Bellow and James Ellroy and all these kind of big, loud kind of stylists, and trying to make my own voice out of that. But I think it was actually with short stories that I started to be embarrassed by them. And shame is a really useful emotion to look out for when you work. When you suddenly go, "Oh God, I didn't put that down, did I?" That's when it's getting interesting, I think. And like with younger writers, the impulse always is to kind of, you come across that horrifying line in the story, right? You go, "Oh, I'll cut that out, and now it sounds cool." But you should actually cut everything else out. and just leave the stuff that horrifies you and make you go, oh my God. Because that's when you're finding your fundamental material, I suppose.
I'm so delighted that you mentioned Saul Bellow, who is a great love of mine. I feel like Henderson the Rain King was the first book I ever fell in love with. I read it at an age when it was inappropriate to read it, but I don't know. He's quite visceral, and he has these sort of passionate, silly characters who you take totally seriously and right off in the same breath. And I see that. I see that in their characters as well. Like, even in the story you were just reading, I love that by one hand, it's completely epic, where it's like for generations, this has been happening. And on the other hand, it's sort of like we're talking about Swiss rolls and totally. I don't know. Could you talk about balancing with the epic?
Well, that's what I responded to immediately when I started reading Saul Bellow, and I think I started reading him kind of late 20s when I was still in Cork City, and probably came to him through. He was always been mentioned in like Martin Amis essays and stuff like this as a great stylist, and of course, you know, at that age you read stuff like Martin Amis and all of that. But it was his blend of high and low, like Chicago low lives and gangsters done in this spectacular language, you know, that just incredible sentences that have such bounce and rhythm to them. And I think you mentioned Henderson the Rain King. I think that was the kind of glorious era for Bellow around kind of mid 60s, 30s, 70s. So Humboldt's Gift and Herzog and Henderson all came around that kind of half decade, and it's a stunning like run of work, one of the greatest runs of work, I'm sure, in terms of prose style in the 20th century. So he's someone, you know, who like I keep the books in the house, but out in my shed where I write, you know, I'm superstitious about having too many books out there, but there's definitely always a Bellow book kept close to the desk. As there might be a Flannery O'Connor book and something like that as well. It was interesting though, as an Irish writer, I was determined to read anything but Irish writers in my 20s and 30s. That stuff was too close to home, you know. It was kind of. I do remember like reading like the late great Irish novelist John McGahern, and reading one of his novels. And just gone, oh God, this is just my father, you know. This stuff is like, you know, it's just too close and uncomfortable. I can read it now and admire it more so, but I was determined to be the great Jewish American novelist. I read too narrowly, I think, in my 20s as well. I would get obsessed with a couple of writers and just read nothing else. And of course, then you're trying to ape them on the page. What you have to do is let lots of different influences kind of meld together from not just from books, from television and from Pixies records you're listening to and whatever else and comic books is going on, and hopefully find your own kind of mongrel style somewhere in all of that.
Mongrel style, I love. I feel like the desire to read people who sound not like you, people who have lived lives unlike you, is sort of a, I don't know, at least for me, is a kind of, I'd rather be anyone but myself. And I did that as well. But you talked about as well sort of this idea of the themes that crop up and then you keep circling them forever and ever. And I couldn't help but notice there's this line in Old Stock where the narrator is talking about a project he's working on, but he says, there is no stepping away from the shadow of your own past. And that gave me this sort of gut punchy feeling, and it reminded me of Night Boat to Tangier as well. Bosses certainly do that. I don't know, are there themes that you feel like you're circling and circling?
Well, this one that you mentioned is the fundamental one in everything I write. I think it's that all the characters are constantly trying to escape the shadow of their own past, and they can never manage to do it, you know. And it is one of the great kind of human comedies. Really, we spend so much time just trying to escape from ourselves and move on to new iterations and versions of self. So we can't do it. All the fundamental stuff has gone in and will always shape you and dictate what you're going to write. But yeah, it's interesting again over the course of 8 or 9 years, just to see the same kind of stories presented themselves. And like I searched around the house, I looked under the sofa and everywhere, I had about 20 stories that were in a more or less kind of finished condition from the last 7 or 8 years. And I wanted to pick a sequence of stories that seemed to kind of speak to each other a little bit. A lot of it was purely geographical, in that the stories have like your short stories follow you around in the world. And I've lived in County Sligo now since 2007. And slowly but surely, the your environs get into the work and start to dictate. Like you make these decisions in your life that seem to be pragmatic things about where you're going to live, where are the mortgages cheap. And like this is a very old police station in a swamp in South County Sligo. So we moved here because it was cheap to buy it and kind of try and put a floor and stuff in it and all of that. But it's then of course that pragmatic decision becomes a key creative decision in your life, because the world around you starts to come in. And like I didn't grow up in the countryside. I grew up in suburbs and small cities, and I've always lived in cities up until 2007. So I think I tend certainly to kind of mythologize the countryside. It's not quite a realistic take on the Irish countryside, like that. Like the story I read from Ox Mountain, that song is a kind of a Western, I guess. It's a kind of a nouveau Western, a West of Ireland Western with a kind of an outlaw figure, a sheriff kind of figure. There's even a ripe widow thrown in, shamelessly, just thrown into the mix. I'm thinking about when I wrote it now, and it was I think also very influenced by Deadwood, which was a TV show I was watching kind of obsessively. At the time, I had a dangerous obsession with that show for a couple of years. So but it is fun to look back at stories and kind of remind yourself where you are kind of emotionally and in literary terms at that time. And it's a great kind of side effect of writing stories. I remember John Cheever's beautiful introduction to his collected stories, where he says that's the best thing about being a story writer. Really, it gives you such a vivid memory of particular times and places in your life when you were writing the stories. They come back to you in a very, very visceral way, those days.
No, absolutely. I've been reading Cheever's journals lately, which are tremendously sad and beautiful. And I'm sitting in Connecticut right now, and they're circling around Connecticut. Why am I in Connecticut and not anywhere else in the world? And there's an old joke that you trot out in one of the stories, which says "cause of death, the west of Ireland." And I wonder, is this to do with your relationship to the West, or?
Yeah, actually, no, I actually genuinely love it here. I kind of just mythologize it in this kind of dark way sometimes. Those Cheever diaries, it's one of the saddest books I've ever read, I think, and beautiful as well. And it gives puts the stories in such kind of relief at that time. But yeah, it's strange. I been based in the west of Ireland. It's kind of it's a great place for a writer, and it's a terrible place for a writer as well, because there's such a literary history. This is more difficult, I guess, when you're a younger writer or an emerging writer. There's so many different sort of huge influences on Irish literature that are very kind of pronounced, and that are there all the time, and you try to have to navigate your way. And there are particular technical difficulties with writing Irish country people. You can seem like you're really overdoing it in terms of, we mentioned accents already, in terms of accents on the page. I think actually that our Irish writers, especially in the west of Ireland, have a lot of the same difficulties as writers of the American South. It can seem very easily like you're kind of over egging it, on the page, but we're not at all. And I've always felt another kind of a great kind of sympathy with Southern American writers, actually. But yeah,
I feel like I used to live just south of the South Georgia border in Florida. And my first impression upon moving there was all of the books were underplaying it. It's even more intense.
It's even more intense. Yeah, this is it. And I mean, like, the west of Ireland for crazy people is just wonderful. Just sit on the Dublin train. I think I have a trustworthy face because they find me and they offload on me and they talk to me and all of that. And it's kind of, and you could never make it up as good as you'll hear it, around the place. But it's it's rich ground for a story writer, I guess. Although, like, Irish people are great talkers. We like to talk a lot, and we're very good at it. we can go forever, but it's also we say very little often. It's quite it's quite guarded. and meanings are concealed under the surface of the talk, and it can take years to discover the meaning of an Irish conversation. 11 years later, oh, the bitch, that's what she meant. But it could take a very, very, very long time. So that's a great kind of resource, to use an ugly word, for sourcing your stories and what's going on just underneath all that kind of barrage of kind of ornamental baroque conversation that goes on all the time.
I'm thinking about one of my favorite stories in the collection is Who's Dead McCarthy. With this it's a story about this sort of public town crier who's the person who, when he comes down walking down the street, he's going to tell you who's died recently.
Yeah.
But there's a moment where the narrator is sort of like, why? Like, why are you telling?
Why are you doing this to us?
Yeah, and he tries to get beneath the surface. I don't know. Could you talk about that character a little bit?
Yeah, he's Who's Dead McCarthy. He's all of my family, really. Even at this relatively tender age, you just constantly get these text messages and WhatsApp messages going, "Do you hear who's dead?" I said, "No, I haven't been in the city. Who's dead?" You get this all the time, and there is an Irish kind of morbid streak, a great fascination with death. There's a website called RIP.ie, which is the Irish thing, and it's the most popular website in the country. People spend hours and hours just poring over this to see who's dead. I don't know, where we're kind of a maritime nation on the edge of the Atlantic. There is a tendency towards a kind of a melancholy as part of our character. There's also a skittishness and a kind of a hysterical edge to it sometimes. But it's there, and sometimes you don't. There are influences that are so big on your personality in your life that you can't even see them. But I think living on the edge of that huge, hissing Atlantic Ocean, with its kind of constantly changing weather, and the sky changes color, 1,000 times a day, and you're blown around the place by gales, and it's kind of, it's certainly a huge influence on our personality as a people. Like if I was to embody the West of Ireland as a single person, and I'd say, how would I describe this person's character? I would say rattled. It's the fundamental thing. Just kind of, or shook, as we say. He was a bit shook. It's just there's kind of an air of kind of nervous hysteria, which is again a great resource for writing. What more often than not, I see them as kind of comic stories. Who's Dead McCarthy is kind of very kind of inky black comedy, but for all that, it is intended for laughs at some level.
No, it's a funny book. It's a funny book that has a lot to do with death. It's a funny book. And I love that my mother is a sort of deluded Irish American person, and she has taped on her bulletin board at all time, I want to say it's a Yeats quote, I'm going to butcher it, something like, he had an abiding sense of tragedy which carried him through the joyous times, or something to that.
Yeah, I think that is Yeats. That is a Yeats quote. Yeah.
We cling to it. But I think you're talking about sort of what's old and what's new. And there's this, I think my favorite bit of the book is the part in St. Catherine of the Fields, where it's the description of the song that the narrator has found, this old Irish language song. And I want to read a tiny bit out of it and ask you about it, where it says, I'm going to sort of skip about in it, but all of human cruelty was contained within it, this song they've found. But something too of what love means, its characters were deformed by desire, and thus the song blew familiar notes through the slutty arcades of my middle-aged brain. It informed me that there had been others before as deranged by matters of the heart and loins as I was now. This was a tremendous relief and consolation. I love it so much. On any art that I encounter. And I think about the title as well, about like this old country music, and I mean, for troubles to be old and new at the same time. And I don't know, it's a big question, but it's in the book. You could talk about.
Yeah, it's the St. Catherine story. That slutty arcades of middle-aged minds is a bit of a giveaway line there. But yeah, I mean, what's interesting, those actual old Irish kind of folk songs, often Irish language, sean-nós is the style of singing. What's very interesting about them, and they might be from the 1700s and further back, is that they can be quite raunchy. They can be very kind of ripe. The whole sort of God-haunted Catholicism really only came into Ireland in the kind of 1900s. Before that, it was considered quite an open-minded country in terms of kind of sexual matters and stuff like that. Like Irish women in the Middle Ages were renowned across the continent for they would kiss strangers on the lips. This would terrify polite Englishmen and Frenchmen, when this would happen. But in greeting, they would kiss on the lips. It was quite open, and a lot of that comes through in that music and in those old kind of ballad song stories. But one of the things I guess that's interesting to trace as well is there's a kind of an outlaw culture that was in Ireland going back to the Middle Ages, and the way that sort of started to influence so much of American song culture as well, because there was Irish immigrants to the American Souths kind of started so much of that stuff, and that whole country and Western thing rings very true in the west of Ireland as well. There's a really terrifying genre known as country and Irish, which is go to YouTube at once when the show is concluded. Look for Big Tom. Look for Big Tom. That's all I'll say to you. But it's kind of that kind of balladeering kind of tradition. It's very hard topic to get into a story in any kind of a convincing way, so I made him this kind of song collector. So he's some kind of academic. He's quite a dodgy narrator, I think. I'm not sure what exactly he's up to. I'm not sure if he's actually making up this song, but it was actually the most recent one I wrote for the book, and I was kind of happy with it. I thought it hit on some kind of good sad old truths. It was also inspired as a John Berger story, set in like the peasant village in the French Alps where he lived for many years, about a kind of a shepherd who was kind of taken advantage of by a city woman who moved up to the mountain village, and that was a really haunting story from late 70s, I think, and that was kind of in my mind as well. Berger had lately died, and I was rereading a lot of his stuff, and that was another influence on it. I think my story is definitely kind of, there's a magpie element. They take influences from lots of different places and try to make something fresh, or that feels fresh for me at least, out of them.
We sort of got into the profane earlier, and now we're talking about body old songs. I wonder, I don't know, I come from a family of fluent cursors. I believe in it, I write in it, I get many angry letters about it, and I feel like the book is also quite visceral, bodily. I feel like a lot of the characters are ill at ease in their bodies. They have sort of inflamed gums and sort of angry bowels. And poor Sergeant Brown is sort of eating a Swiss roll and hating. I don't know. There's a bodiliness and there's a profanity that for me is a great joy of the book. But I wonder if you could talk about that.
It's a really interesting way of describing it, and it's also, it would describe a lot of fiction that I really like, when you sense the characters kind of pure bodily discomfort and kind of unease with themselves. Again, I'm writing about Irish people, so this is quite a typical or a useful road to go down. I don't know. It's short stories. I mean, this is my third collection, which worries me because it seems like a bit of a statement. You could almost do a second collection by accident, but a third collection seems like I'm going to keep doing these things, and I probably will. I think I'm a lifer with them, because and what attracts me to them is their difficulty. They're so hard. Do you write stories, CJ, as well as novels?
I do, and then it's been a long time since I gave proper time to it because it's so hard.
It's really unforgiving, and most stories that I write don't work out. But I still kind of try for them, and I try to finish them. Even if I know at the time that the story is kind of crap and I'll never show it to anyone, I kind of have a superstitious thing that I'll finish it, and kind of in the belief that you earn the good ones by finishing all the terrible ones as well. But I remember before I was publishing fiction, I used to write a lot of freelance journalism, and I was interviewing the great Scottish story writer James Kelman around 2000 or 2001. He had a collection out at the time, and he said something that was really kind of terrifying, and but turns out to be true. He said it's not easier that they get stories, and the closer you get into the form, it's almost the more mysterious they become. Like they are all about timing, the internal timing in the story. I never can tell why one works out and one why another doesn't. Like you begin each story with that sense of vaulting ambition that this is the one, this is going to be, a real breakthrough story for you, and most fall flat on their faces. I think the short story has almost as much in common with the poem or with the painting as it does with the novel. It's kind of, it's a spooky and kind of mysterious art. There's nothing like it when one works out, when you can suddenly feel you're kind of, your hand is guided across the page as you get into the closing kind of stretch of a first draft of a story. I will usually know by the end of a first draft if it's worth keeping and working with. And usually what happens is it surprises me in some way that it goes in a direction that I wasn't quite expecting.
I really love about this collection that the stories, they hang together, they belong together, and they need to belong together. And I think part of that, I have to read a tiny bit of the epigraph, which the moment I opened the book and saw the epigraph from Jane Campion, I was like, oh God, what am I in for? I'm so excited. But this line about, I think that the romantic impulse is in all of us, and that sometimes we live it for a short time, but it's not part of a sensible way of living. It can be the path of the foolhardy and the compulsive. And I feel like a lot of these characters are romantics, and they're running away, some of them. I mean, Hannah Cryan is running away. Kizzy is running away, and then Seamus and Edward are sort of hiding away, and the narrator in Oldstock is sort of like, maybe I can live in Uncle Aldo's cottage forever and be a new person. And there's this romanticism in this retreat that I see sort of happening again and again. Is that something, I don't know, is that why you chose these stories?
Yeah, one of the central things was the way the characters, so many of them were constantly kind of looking for fresh iterations of themselves. Some kind of new way of presenting themselves and of being. It's also kind of like the great fun of a story collection is ordering the sequence of it, and I spend lots of time sketching down my track list, and I absolutely think about like favorite records and stuff as well. Like thinking about Marvin Gaye records and things, what's going on, how he structures it, and you try to kind of but of course readers then annoyingly come along and don't read the stories in sequence. I know I don't with the story collection, but
that's pathological. You don't read them in order?
No, I don't, and I totally expect my readers should, but I generally read what I have time for, kind of a thing. But it's it is kind of an unforgiving kind of form, but at the same time, as a reader, I think there's nothing more intense than being in the grip of a good short story. It's an incredibly, because the period of time you're with the piece of work is so much shorter, it's really intensified, and it can feel like the story is sucking all the air out of the room if it's good enough, and you're really kind of involved, and it's so it's worth sticking with despite all the tears and recriminations with yourself when they don't work out.
Well, I believe in the penultimate spot on a record being sort of the place where the thing of glory goes, and I love that's
critical. Yeah, that is critical.
Oh, I have so many more questions, but I'm pretty sure I'm supposed to stop hogging the time and to turn us over to Annie and to questions at that point. So thank you so much for answering.
Thank you, CJ. It was lovely.
CJ, you can absolutely keep going. Everyone who's watching, thank you for being here. If you have questions, write them now. But we don't have any questions in the chat yet. So CJ, let's do another one.
Well, in that case, I want to ask about Redka and the Bug House and why it's last, and sort of how did you come to know this history of him? I don't know, having a health crisis in County Galway.
Yeah, there was a memoir by an Irish poet called Richard Murphy called The Kick that came out about 15 or so years ago, and that little anecdote is all that it is in that book, where he invited Redka to this little island off the coast of Galway in the about 1960, I think, and Redka showed up with his young wife Beatrice, and he was in the midst of a kind of at the time would have been referred to as a manic episode. He was having a massive crack up, and he just caused havoc on this very small island, to the point where the locals got together in the community hall and said, "We've got to get this guy off the island," because he was just up drinking all night and chasing the women and just going crazy. So he was committed to the psychiatric hospital in Ballinasloe, back on the mainland. I never knew very much about him. I biographically, I knew he was a bit of a car crash as a personality. I was always very moved by the poems when I came across them, and his poetic line has a very lovely kind of a mid-century glamour to it, if I could put it that way. And it's one of my favorite stories that I've written, I think, because it's very rare that the story will live up to your initial ambition for it. But I felt I got a language for him that felt true, and that felt right. And I wrote it very quickly, over a period of about 3 days, actually out on the island. It was one of those very useful occasions when I had a deadline. I'd promised the Irish Times newspaper a short story by like the Tuesday or something, and it was Friday, and I was out on that island, and I remembered the Retka story, and there was a little plaque in a bar out there, a memorial that he had visited, and it was almost like Theodore Retka had a crack up here, and I just kind of, as I drifted around the island for a couple of days, I kept my notebook with me, and it was a weird occasion, the weirdly rare time where you feel quite inspired, and it felt like a gift. It was funny. It was like a Friday and Saturday in June, and I had finished my novel Beetlebone about 3 days earlier, which involves John Lennon on an island in the west of Ireland. And I was years coming and going from that book. It was very difficult. And when I finished it on the Tuesday, I said, "That's it. Never again am I putting a real person into the fiction. It's too much responsibility and it's too much work." And by the Friday, I was at it again with Retka, But it's one of the ones that I just it needed very little in terms of subsequent drafts or anything. It would just kind of came in a swoop, and it always felt like the story I wanted to close the collection with.
I love there's such great dialogue between Redka and the therapist in that story, and I just love, I don't know, there's something so satisfying about good dialogue, and there's so much good bantery dialogue in this book, and I wonder, I don't know, what do you think makes for good dialogue? Who's a writer of dialogue for screen or prose wise that you admire, or are you eavesdropper in that?
I steal a lot from what I hear around the place and on trains and stuff in Ireland. But sometimes in crime fiction, some of the very best dialogue writers, like Elmore Leonard in the 1970s, was an incredible dialogue writer. Was as good as Pinter or Beckett in terms of stripped down, kind of menacing, comic menace. I read plays a lot. What I do believe in strongly is if dialogue is a strength of mine. I think if you can be very good at something, if you work at it enough, you can be great at it, possibly. So the bits of my stories that get most in terms of drafts are always the stretches of dialogue. I will do them kind of insane amounts of times, and I will do them aloud with pen in hand, to catch any kind of evasions. Are places where the dialogue is going off the beat of the story, but it's huge. It's usually a very, very positive sign for a story if the characters kind of won't shut up, and if it's your difficulty is getting them to stop talking. That was very much the case with the most recent novel, Nightboat to Tangier, where my two kind of Cork city gangsters, Morris and Charlie, they just wouldn't shut up for months on end. And I was never happier than when I sent that book out the door to the editors. And then, of course, I missed them, They annoyed me greatly for 12 months, and then I really missed them when they were gone.
I mean, I imagine you have them in your head and you know what they would, like, sort of how they would take a topic and latch on to it and sort of toss it about. I mean, that must be a loss.
I write lots of double acts as well. Double acts show up all the time. Like you mentioned, Retka and the psychiatrist doctor in that story, O'Reilly, and I can see them coming now. These new kind of double acts and these new pairings, and think, oh God, not another back and forth, you know. But it's you can just have such fun with that as well, and it can be such a great engine for a piece of short fiction that to get that going.
I never write anything with one person on their own. I have no interest in that.
Yeah.
It's the back and forth snowball effect that I think is so compelling.
Yeah, and it's like there is a story in the book called Roma Kid about this young girl who's kind of just in kind of early adolescence, and it starts in a kind of a realist mode, but becomes a kind of a fairy tale when she meets an old hermit little man in the woods, and they strike up a friendship. But I didn't know that story really needed her to find this person in the woods, and it really kind of started to surprise me then. The initial prompt for it was just a visual image on I keep mentioning the Sligo to Dublin train, but just seeing a young girl, a Roman girl, clearly on her own and looking a little worried, one day just sitting in between two carriages and trying to figure out, can I possibly get a worldview for her and find my way into it. And it was when I gave her someone to talk to, essentially, that the story started to come through.
I worried for her as a reader, and I wondered if she was going to turn out all right. And then I think, in as much as an ending that involves her living alone by herself in the woods forever is a happy ending, I felt like that was a very happy ending, in the sense of all of these things are happening and it has nothing to do with you. You are here and you are doing what you know to live and survive. And I know that sort of muting the world, I thought was interesting.
It was the ending kind of was a happy surprise to me. I didn't know where it was going, and it started, the time frame of the story started to accelerate very quickly in the closing kind of page of it. We'd been going through on a minute by minute basis, and suddenly we were going through decades, and that seemed like great fun at the time. But yeah, it's kind of one of my favorites as well, because I kind of I usually don't think about the characters very much after I've put away the final draft, but she comes back to me sometimes, and I think about her sometimes.
I love that. I have, if no one else is going to bust in, I have a cheeky question. Oh, but maybe someone else does.
Oh no, I don't have it. I was just gonna say one more. CJ,
Well, I have a last cheeky question, which, did you say you live in what used to be a police station?
Yes, I do. So this was built in the 1840s as a police barracks, and I work in what used to be a holding cell out in the backyard, and I only occasionally feel like I'm serving a sentence there. Yeah, it's a very characterful old house. Tragically, there are no ghosts. I was convinced there would surely be like the ghost of some tortured Fenian prisoners, but no such luck. But no, it's a good place to be based for a writer. It can, this time of year, January, February, it can seem to be everything seems quite dormant, and it can seem to be asleep. You just have to kind of tap on the place and wake it to feed you creatively. But it's what's been very interesting this year, because we've all been in our kind of lockdown situations and staying pretty much close to home, is just concentrating on, like, the rule here is you can go 5 kilometers in a circuit of your house. That's as far as you're supposed to go in the present lockdown. So you start to know this patch of land, even at a real textural kind of level, you're around for every passing season and every change in the fall of light and all of that, and it's really great texture for your work as a fiction writer. Like I'm very dedicated to the story as a form, and I try to improve. And I came across a great quote from the painter, what's his name, David Hockney, who said, paying attention to textural detail in any work of art is you just have to constantly push your own quality of attention. And so he has little tricks. So whenever he's out walking anywhere, he asks himself, what color is the road? And when you start doing things like this, it's really, really interesting. And you make the marvelous discovery that the road is never the same color twice. And it's just a beautiful way of bringing little textures into your worlds on the fictional page and trying to make them come to life.
What color is the road is something I'm going to carry with me. And
It's once it lodges in your brain, it's a great one to have because you keep checking it out, and it's amazing the quality. I do see a question about poets.
Yes, it's a good question from Aaron. Are there particular poems or poets you turn to for inspiration or pleasure?
Yeah, I don't know if pleasure is the word with Philip Larkin, who I go back to a lot. The great relief from reading Larkin is that he's always more miserable than you could possibly be yourself. You know, Larkin is always feeling much worse than anybody could possibly feel. So that's a kind of great relief. I have a great feeling for American kind of mid-century stuff. Robert Lowell, Elizabeth Bishop. I go back to both of those a lot. Redke increasingly. But I you know, it's January and resolutions. I'm trying to make myself read more work in translation, and I'm not good enough about that yet. But I try to read new work as well. You have, of course, got an amazing poetry publisher in Minneapolis, in Grey Wolf, with my friends there. So I keep an eye on what's coming out of those presses.
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Aaron. If we don't have any more questions, I'll do my final bookseller question as I grab the links for books that we are talking about today. I will drop them in the chat. While I do that, can each of you please give our viewers one recommendation for their further reading?
I always have 1,000. My students know this. I'm tedious. But I just finished reading Diane Cook's The New Wilderness, and it was everything that I wanted in a book. It was these people surviving in the wild and being bad at surviving in the wild, and they had to, but they didn't want to. And the children were right about everything, and the adults were always wrong. And it's a glorious, visceral book. And it's apocalyptic it's apocalyptic in a way that like my side of the mountain is apocalyptic, and I loved it so. And I also just want to hold up the American edition because I know you don't have it there.
Isn't it gorgeous? Yeah, I really like it.
It's a beautiful object, and actually I had it out on the coffee table, and my father said, "That looks like a real book."
It does. It's proper.
It looks like a real book, and I was like, okay, yes.
Amazing. And Kevin, you have one recommendation for everyone?
Yeah, well, in terms of what I was just talking about there, about kind of studying your local patch of ground in a much more intense way than you usually would. Someone who does that, an old favorite who I've gone back to a lot over kind of lockdowns over the last year, is great American essayist Danny Dillard. Over the last kind of week or two, there's a collected essays called The Abundance that came out on this side. I'm not sure if it came out under the same title in the US, but it goes from her work from, I guess, early 70s up to the present, very often involved with, environmental stuff. She's very dense, sometimes very difficult. I would read entire paragraphs where I haven't a clue what's going on, but I'll stay with it because of the rhythm, because the rhythm is so beautiful. She wrote a book called Holy the Plough in the late 70s, and I've read it more than once, and I haven't a clue what's going on in that book, but it's beautiful, and I'll always go back to it. And she's just someone I'll always go back to in my reading life.
Well, wonderful. Thank you. So 2 recommendations on top of our recommendation that you check out the books by Kevin Barry and CJ Hauser, but I just put links to in the comments here, so you can go straight to majorsandquinn.com and search for titles or authors, or you can click these links here. I want to thank you all for tuning in on this January evening for one of the first virtual author events of 2021. We're still going strong with virtual events. However, if you do happen to be in the Twin Cities area, just know that Majors and Quinn is open to limited in-store browsing. So if you are around and you want to come say hi, please do. A limited number of people are allowed in the store at a time. Our hours are 10 to 7 daily. You, of course, have to wear a mask, and our booksellers would love to see you. So come see us if you can. Otherwise, head to our website, which is available 24/7. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, CJ. This was a fantastic conversation. I wrote a lot of notes. You guys had a lot of good terms of phrase that I am trying to remember. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Annie. Hope to get back properly.
Absolutely.
By the time I get another collection of stories together.
Yes.
Thanks a million. Thanks so much.
Yeah,
And thanks CJ so much for doing it. You're very kind.
It was thrilling. I'm glad to have been here.
It was great fun. I really enjoyed it. Thanks, guys. Okay.
All right,
I drift off into the ether.